Hello, viewers. Welcome to yet another episode of Tata Katha Season 2, wherein we are in talks with Mr. Harish Bhat, brand custodian Tata Sons, and author of these two lovely books, Tata Log and Tata Stories. Welcome, sir, to this episode.
Thank you, Girish. It's been such a pleasure, conversing with you over this series of Tata Kathas and about my book, Tata Stories. We have covered so many stories over the past 4 episodes, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you.
So thank you so much for your time as well. And I know you're a very busy person, and thank you so much for taking out time. It was wonderful listening to all these stories that we have gone together. I wanted to know that what is it that made you write this particular book? Because you have already covered a few stories in the previous one, which is Tata Log, which is this one. And to have these 40 stories was, first of all, quite interesting because, like I told you in the first episode, both my daughter and my mom, both of them have read stories from the book. And I, of course, have read all the 40 stories. So it caters to, so there is no genre for this, no audience for this book. Even a 14-year-old daughter can read it as well as a 75-year mother can read it. So wanted to know that what is it that made you write this book now?
So, Girish, you're quite right. Many readers have talked to me about Tata Stories and said that they have read it, their parents have read it, their children have read it. A couple of women have even told me that they've read it out as bedtime tales to their children. So I also struggle with the genre. This is certainly not a corporate book. Okay? It is true that these are stories from the Tata Group, but I think these are lessons that we can all use in our lives. So they happen to be stories from the Tata Group, but they are timeless lessons in all our lives, which is why, I actually call this 40 timeless tales to inspire you. And the word inspire is very important, Girish, because that is what led to my writing this book. I've been working with the Tata Group now for 34 years. I joined the group in 1987, and I've been greatly inspired by the contributions that this group has made to nation building, to being a pioneering institution, to the community around us. So when the pandemic came into our lives, if you remember, in March 2020, we went into a lockdown across the country. And if you remember those first few months, they were somewhat depressing. We were trying to get used to this new reality of a lockdown, working from home. I had also, by the way, I was also saving some time on travel to office and back. So I said, why not do something during this period of time which elevates the spirits of readers, elevates the spirits of people? And since I'm passionate about writing, I said, let me write a few inspiring stories drawn from the history of the Tata, because that's the group I know best. So it did not start as this book. It started with a few inspiring stories which I posted on LinkedIn. The first story I still remember was about Lady Meherbai Tata that I wrote. And then I wrote a couple of stories about J.R.D. Tata. I wrote a story about Dr. John Mathai. By the time I completed writing 4 or 5 stories on LinkedIn, I saw that the response was huge. People were resonating with these stories. People said that this is giving us a point of inspiration during a period of time which is fairly depressing in our lives. And readers wrote back saying, write some more. We are looking forward to these stories. So that's how this voyage actually started, Girish. It did not start as the idea of a book. It started as the idea of writing a few inspiring stories from the Tata Group. And when I saw that readers were resonating with it so much, I was encouraged to write even more. And then eventually, I think my publishers, Penguin Random House, got interested in this concept and they wanted to publish it as a book, 40 stories together. So that's how the idea of Tata Stories was born.
Sir, which brings me on to another question. Now, since the book was written during the pandemic, and the book covers quite a long time span, I think, right from Jamsetji Tata's journey on that ship along with Swami Vivekananda to, I think, the latest one, perhaps, I don't know which is the last story that you have covered. The last one in the book, of course, is Darbari Seth's story. But I don't know in terms of timeline, which is the last one that you have covered. how did you manage the logistics of it? Because you have drawn on a lot of resources from Tata Central Archives. So it must have been quite an effort, first of all, to select the stories and then to draw out a lot of research material from there and then to put it together in a book
So to
format.
tell you the truth, Girish, ever since I wrote Tata Log, my first book, I have been a keen student of the history of the Tata Group. And to tell you the truth, I opted to write the stories which appealed most to my imagination from the history of the group. So what I would do is pick a particular theme or pick a particular event which to me was greatly inspiring from the Tata Group's either long past history or recent history. Then I would get in touch with the Tata Central Archives, where my good friend Mr. Nadla, who is the Central Archives Chief Archivist, he would provide me the documents that the archives had relating to that story. These could be, letters, it could be old newspaper articles, or it could be old issues of the Tata Review, or it could be some research papers. I would then read through all these and in my mind try to develop a theme for the story. In some stories it was easy to do that. In some stories it was more challenging, because at the end of the day the story needs to be very simple and the theme needs to be inspiring. So once it came together in my mind as a theme, I would then decide that yes, this is the story that I would write. So to tell you the truth, there was no great strategy which went into which story is to be part of this book and which story is not. These are stories which have appealed to me as an author, to my imagination. And the Tata Group has so many more stories. So, there are many, many stories I have not covered in this book. So please take this as more a personal author's choice of which stories should feature.
One of the things which I have greatly admired, sir, is the crispness of the book and the easy to read format in which it has been written. How did you manage that? Because, and also, sir, if I may say, the fact that, you make the reader as a co-participant in the journey. Yeah. So, for example, in that episode, in the story wherein you have written about Jamsetji Tata meeting Swami Vivekananda, you have said, "Come, let us go on the ship and look at experience the voyage," kind of a thing. So that appealed to me quite a bit. In fact, I think that is what appealed to perhaps, I think my daughter as well, because I had given her this story called The Race to read. And she's quite a young girl, about 15. And I told her that this is one story which you read because that is the story which I liked. And it was quite, so the writing style in The Race was completely in contrast with, let us say, the writing style of, much more a much more subtle story like The Astronaut and the Pioneer. So how did you bring about that kind of, that kind of a mixture, if that's the right word to use, in your writing?
So, the first thing is about the crispness of the stories, Girish. And, I was initially, as I told you, I was writing these stories on LinkedIn. And I understood that modern reader attention spans are shrinking by the day. And I understood from the first few Tata stories that I posted on LinkedIn, that I needed to keep a story short enough to be read within about 5 or 6 minutes. If I kept a story longer than that, I was losing a little bit of reader attention. So every story in this book, every story in Tata Stories can be read within 6 minutes. I developed that for myself as a 6-minute rule of storytelling. That the story should be read within 6 minutes, which means then I had to write the story to a specific number of words so that it could be read within 6 minutes. And that has, I think, proved to be very, very appealing to many readers, because you don't want to spend a lot of time sitting and reading this at one go. You can pick up a story, read it, go away, and reflect on it. Bringing the reader into the story is a craft that I have learned from some of the best storytellers in the world. I admire greatly storytellers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Salman Rushdie or Rabindranath Tagore. All of them bring the reader into the story and make the reader a participant in the story rather than a passive observer of the story. I've tried to do that. I'm not sure I've done it so successfully in every single story, but in many of them I've tried to do that. Now, if you look at these stories, some of these stories, like The Race, which is your daughter's favorite, you said, story in the book, some of
Hmm.
these stories are very linear in their flow. The Race is a very linear story from the time the race starts till the time it ends. And I don't want to spill the beans, but the epilogue of that story. Okay, it's a very linear story across time. So that requires a certain genre of storytelling. Whereas some stories do go back and forth, like The Astronaut and the Pioneer goes all the way from 1932 to 1982 to Kalpana Chawla's voyage into space, comes back into 1932 with the black and white photograph of G.R.D. Tata, and then goes all the way to those photographs and memorabilia reaching Mr. Tata. So some stories go back and forth in time, and I think they require a different narrative. They're also a little more challenging to tell because you have to take people back and forth in time yet not lose the thread of the story. It's like, when you see some movies, you have flashbacks, and some
Hmm.
movies are just linear from one end to the other.
Hmm.
So that's how but most importantly, Girish, towards the end of each story, for most of these stories, what I have tried to draw out is what lesson has this story taught me?
Hmm.
End of writing the story, I've reflected it and said, ये story पढ़ने से what is the benefit to my life? What is the value I have got? And I've tried to summarize that, and that I think has resonated with many readers. Because at the end of the day, a story can be entertainment, a story can be information, a story can just be magical, but a story can also be very meaningful. And it is the meaningful stories which I think last for a long period of time. If you look at if look at epics across the world, whether it is the Bible or Mahabharata or Ramayana, those are beautiful books to be read as stories by themselves, but they hold very, very deep lessons for all of us. So I also try to draw out lessons from many of these stories and present them, because I'm sure many students, many young entrepreneurs, many managers like you and me uh, are looking for what lesson can I pick up from this and use in my day-to-day job or use in my life. So those are some of the concepts, Girish, of storytelling that I used. But of course, the story has to be interesting. It has to be gripping. There needs to be surprise. There needs to be sometimes a twist in the tail. And each of those feature in many of these stories as you go along.
Sir, almost everyone who's read the book has a favorite Tata story from the book. And I would therefore like to ask you, which is your favorite Tata story from your own book, which you have written?
The story which I found most interesting and challenging to write, Girish, and therefore it is a favorite with me, is the story of Swami Vivekananda and Jamshedji Tata. The other story, which is my all-time favorite, is the story of Jamshedji Tata inviting Charles Page Perrin to India, and how he does that, and the remarkable manner in which he succeeds in getting one of the world's finest engineers to come to the country and help him set up Tata Steel. Um, both these stories, to me, reflect different things. In the case of the Swami Vivekananda and Jamshedji Tata story, it's all about two legendary people trying to do something for the nation. In the case of Charles Page Perrin's story, it reflects to me the courage that Jamshedji Tata had, going into the United States as a relatively unknown uh, Indian merchant, and being able to attract the best talent from there to come back to the country. That's why I think these two stories appeal greatly to me. The Swami Vivekananda and Jamshedji Tata story has also remained etched in my imagination because it took me a long time to develop the theme of that story. And it took me a long time to prepare to narrate that story. To tell you the truth, it was not coming together in my mind at the first go or the second go. I had to struggle a little bit with the writing of that story because there are so many themes which flow into creating that narrative. Eventually, I should tell you this, I was getting stuck on what should the narration of that story be. So eventually one evening, I was sitting right here in my study and bedroom. I said, let me just look at YouTube and see if there are any videos of Swami Vivekananda. And I found a video which had his address to the World Parliament of Religions, and where he starts Sisters and Brothers of America, and then there's a huge round of applause. I listened to that video, and then I think I got inspired by that myself. Then I sat down and wrote the story about it.
Oh, that's very interesting, sir. I remember reading your stories right from the time that you started posting them on LinkedIn. The first one, like you said, was on Lady Meherbai Tata. And as you started posting these, and these came during the lockdown as well. So it was quite interesting, to have something interesting to read during those days. And then, when I think you were on the third or fourth story, I was thinking myself that, I was thinking that would it not be nice that if all these things get accumulated and if it comes out as a book? And lo and behold, I think 2-3 months after that, I see that there is a book that has been announced. And I was so glad that you've written this, sir. Now we have written 2 books on the Tata Group, the Tata Log and Tata Stories. Any other books that you have in mind, sir, for the future on the Tata Group?
Yeah. So Harish, firstly, these 2 books are quite different from each other. Tata Log is long form stories.
Yes.
In much greater detail, but only 8 stories. Tata Stories is more short stories. I think if I were to call this a genre, I would say the genre is corporate short stories. But 40 of them, each of them can be read within 6 minutes each. Yes, of course, I have some thoughts about books that I'd like to write in the future. I would like to use all the experience I've gained as a manager in the Tata Group to try to see how I can add value to my readers. So without going into the details of the books that I have in my mind, I would say that my endeavor in writing any book in the future would be, can a reader gain a lot of value from it? And that is the criterion which I would use to decide whether to write a book or not.
I'm sure that would be interesting, sir, and which brings me to the subject of your own journey within the Tata Group. So if you could tell us about your selection from TAS and then the journey that you had over the last 34 years, specifically the TAS training program, and then the first few years as a marketer, because you developed a passion for marketing during your early years. And then we'll come to other questions on your leadership role.
So, Girish, I believe it has been the privilege of a lifetime for me to work with the Tata. I could not have found a better employer, a better place to work in. And I think the Tata Group has really shaped my life, which is why I've also chosen to stay and work with this remarkable group, which is much more than just a corporate business house. It is, truly speaking, an institution. In fact, in Tata Log, I've called it a timeless institution, which has stood the test of time and continues to grow from strength to strength. I joined the Tata Group as a TAS probationer in the year 1987. In the first year, even now, and those days as well, we had to do a few projects with companies to get a flavor of the group. So I did projects with Tata Motors, with Titan, with Tata Tea, with Tata Industries, with the Taj Group of hotels. And then I joined Tata Tea for my first full-time role, starting as executive assistant to our then joint managing director, Mr. R.K. Krishnakumar, who was also therefore my first boss within the Tata Group. And I've learned so much from him over the years. After that, I moved into a sales and marketing role, marketing some of our regional brands like Gemini Dust and Chakra Gold, and launching some new brands like Tata Tea Agni, and then I became the marketing head of Tata Tea. That was the first decade of my career. In between, it was punctuated also by 2 years that I spent as executive assistant to Darbari Seth. So 1987 to about 2013 or 14 years, the primary stint was with Tata Tea there. And That was a wonderful stage of my career because we were a small plantation company. We were competing with Brook Bond, Lipton, which later became part of Hindustan Lever, and building market share for our brands right from scratch. It taught me some of the fundamentals of marketing. I had to dirty my hands, understand what works in the marketplace, what does not, how to build brands. I was also responsible for our sales and distribution network in the state of Andhra Pradesh. So I learned a lot about sales and distribution and what happens on the ground. And we steadily, built and built and built our brands till we became a very formidable competitor in the market. With all our brands, Tata Tea, Kanan Devan, Chakra Gold, Gemini Dust, all doing very well. But sometime in the year 2000, I was asked by the Tata Group whether I'd like to move to Titan and to the jewelry business of Titan, specifically Tanishq. At that time, there was a management transition happening in Tanishq, and I was offered the role of the retailing and marketing head in Tanishq. I knew nothing about jewelry or jewelry marketing. To tell you the truth, I'd spent the first 13, 14 years steeped in the world of tea and coffee. Also, Tanishq at that time was losing money and was not as successful a business as you know it today. But I chose to take that risk because I wanted to push myself out of a zone of comfort and move into yet another new learning zone. And therefore, I joined Tanishq at that time. I believe that I had one of the richest learning experiences of my life, being part of a team that turned around that brand and made it successful and profitable. I still remember those years of working with my, Chief Operating Officer, Jacob Kurian, who was leading the business at that time. And the enormous amount of things I learned from him and from the rest of the team, that we were a very small, compact team working together. But we were able to successfully turn around the business, and that sticks in my mind as a key learning, the manner in which we did it, by creating the right consumer value proposition, by putting together the right marketing and retailing initiatives, and by setting a purpose for ourselves and having belief that we will go there and achieve what we want to. I then had a brief stint with the telecom business of the group. And then I came back to Titan after that as the Chief Operating Officer of the watches and accessories business. Titan was already a very powerful brand by then. So it was a question of nurturing the Titan brand, delivering its appeal to newer segments in the market. And of course, over that period of time, I think we built two other very strong brands, Fast Track and Sonata. So once again, building Fast Track was very different from building Tanishq or building Tata, because you were appealing to youngsters, college-going youngsters. You had to build a brand which talks their language, walks the edge, so to speak. So those were some of the defining stints in my career with the Tata Group. Before I became the managing director of Tata Global Beverages. And then for the last few years, I've been in my current role as brand custodian at Tata Sons. A very, very rich and very, very rewarding 34 years with the group, where I've tried my best to, contribute. There are things I've done well and perhaps things I could have done better. But if there's one thing I take away from my journey so far, it is the ability to create very appealing brands.
Which brings me on to your current role, sir, of that of a brand custodian for perhaps India's largest and most well-known and respected brands, the Tatas. Now, this is a very unique role and something that I'm sure the viewers would like to know a little bit more about. So therefore, if you could tell us what does your current role encompass and what does the day-to-day activity look like, that would be of some help to the viewers.
So it's a very broad role, Harish. Firstly, it's such a privilege to be the custodian of India's most valuable brand, the Tata brand, and also a brand which is iconic in the country, a brand which is, whose products and services are used by virtually half the population in India, and a brand which is a household name across the length and breadth of our country. A brand custodian's role, at least it's a broad role, and the way I have been able to define the role. The first is that this is a 153-year young brand, and we need to carefully nurture it. It needs to be true to the ideas that it stands for. The idea of the community, uplifting the life of the community, the idea of being pioneering, the idea of doing business in the right manner, providing our customers products and services of the highest quality. So one important role that I play is doing my best to ensure that the brand and all the brands associated with Tata, all the brands which leverage Tata, stay true to this idea of it. While at the same time, I think our operating businesses have a number of brands by themselves, like Tata Tea or Tata Salt or Tata Motors or Titan or Tanishq or Voltas. I can name a number of brands, but all of them in some manner or the other have stayed true to the idea of what Tata is about. And then, of course, we have to nurture the Tata brand for the next generation. We have to ensure that there's a brand which continues to remain young, speaks to the young at heart, and there are a number of initiatives around that we undertake. Whether it is, the Tata Crucible Quiz, which is India's largest corporate and campus quiz, whether it's the Tata Mumbai Marathon or the Tata Ultra Marathon or the Tata Building India School Essay Competition, or the Tata Literature Live Festival, and so forth. So that's one part of the brand custodian's role, which is ensuring we stay true to the idea of the brand and nurturing the brand for the future and keeping it very young and vibrant. The second part of the brand custodian's role, Girish, is, as you're aware, there are many, many companies of the Tata Group which use the Tata brand. Right from, Tata Motors, Tata Steel, Tata Consultancy Services, Tata Consumer Products, Tata Power, Titan, Voltas, Trent, etc. So the brand has to be used in a consistent fashion across these companies. While each company is catering to a different product category, it could be salt, it could be software, it could be digital services, it could be, watches and jewelry or garments and lifestyle, but the usage of the brand has to be consistent, because otherwise the brand will get diluted very quickly. And the other part of this role, therefore, is to ensure that the brand remains true to its identity. There is an identity with which it works across both the mature companies and the newer companies of the group. The third is, of course, Girish, to ensure that the key messages of this brand are propagated in the appropriate manner. This book, Tata Stories, is one step towards that. The key stories of the brand being told in a manner that it can be understood and appreciated widely by lay people, by consumers, by influencers, and so forth. That is particularly important, Girish, because when a brand is 153 years of age, you need to constantly, refresh and replenish these stories in people's minds. Youngsters today may not be aware of what this brand has done in the past or what it is doing currently. And therefore, I think the right blend of history, heritage, modernity, and forward-looking aspects of the brand have to come together. So part of the role is also being a storyteller for the brand, or you, as you may say, a sutradhar for the brand. So that's also a part of the brand custodian's role. And finally, of course, Girish, we have to track the brand, measure the health of the brand very carefully, make sure we understand the areas where the brand is doing well and where we need to improve, have a very open mind to learning from the best in the world and seeing how we can incorporate some Western class practices into what we do of the Tata brand. So these are some broad elements of the brand custodian's role. It's a role that it's a great privilege to occupy, and one that I enjoy every single day.
So you have been with us for the last 4 episodes, and we have had an interesting journey. You have narrated, I think, close to 15, 16 stories. We have known Harish Bhat as a manager, as an exceptional leader. The viewers would also like to know Harish Bhat as a person, sir. And therefore, I have a very interesting session called a rapid fire session, if I may call it that, wherein I'll just ask you certain questions and would like to know your top of the mind answers to that. And that's a marketing term, if I'm not mistaken, top of the mind.
No, I'm a very avid quizzer, so I've gone through many rapid fire sessions at the hands of quiz masters. So one more with you would be most welcome.
Right, sir. So the first one is, and this is not perhaps a rapid fire one, but I wanted to know that who have been the early influencers in your life, sir?
The early influences in my life have really been my parents, both my mother and my father. The way they have led their lives with honesty, with dedication, with a sense of purpose. Uh, my father used to work in Canara Bank, where he worked throughout his career of 40 years. My mother began her career as a teacher, but in later years, she was a teacher to us at home. Um, so I think the early influencers were actually both my parents, who have left a deep mark on me. And if you ask me with respect to my career, the early influencers have been people like Mr. R.K. Krishna Kumar and Tatwari Seth, who were my first bosses within the Tata Group. And everything that I have learned from them, which has helped me in very good stead until today.
Right, sir. Now, your favorite author, since you yourself are quite a prolific author, who's been your favorite author, sir?
My favorite author is Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I go back to reading his book, 100 Years of Solitude, every year. It's
All right.
fascinating.
Oh, interesting. And favorite food, sir, favorite cuisine?
My favorite cuisine, I would say, is Japanese cuisine. I love sushi and sashimi and all the raw seafood of Japanese with its delectable and subtle flavors. Um, but very close to Japanese cuisine is Konkani cuisine, which is from my homeland of
Right.
Man.
Right. Okay. And favorite coffee at Starbucks outlet?
Favorite coffee at a Starbucks outlet would be the Americano, the black coffee.
All right. Favorite car from Tata Motors?
The Tata Nexon, which I drive on the roads of Mumbai. So I have currently, a white and gray Tata Nexon, which is beautiful, lots of space, very sturdy. I feel very safe in it. At the same time, it's got some beautiful styling.
Right. And favorite Taj hotel globally?
Favorite Taj hotel globally would be the Taj Fort Aguada Beach Resort in Goa. That's where my wife and I go to. We've been there at least 8 or 9 times over the past 25 years. Um, we love the Shinkarin Beach, which is attached to the Fort Aguada Beach Resort, the restaurants in the hotel. And even for our 25th wedding anniversary, that's where we went. So no doubt
All
about
right.
it.
Interesting. And so favorite Indian actor?
Favorite Indian actor at this point in time, I think the person whom I have a great deal of admiration for would be Amir Khan. I love the movies that he's made. Uh, Lagan is an all-time favorite. Dil Chahta Hai is an all-time favorite. Uh, I think Tare Zameen Par is an all-time favorite. So many movies of Amir Khan which are memorable in my mind. But if I go back to my younger school days, I would say Sanjeev Kumar was my favorite. And
Oh, that's quite interesting.
The movie which stands out in my mind is actually Andi.
Yes, I remember seeing that. Yeah.
Which I continue listening to those songs even today. They are so moving, so emotive. Yet at the time, the way he came across in that movie, something stood out and something keeps haunting me. And then later, of course, I also saw him in Sholay.
Right. Which brings us to an end, sir, of this episode. Thank you so much for being with us for the last 4 or 5 episodes. It was a pleasure having you, pleasure listening to all the stories. You have not only written the stories with a fair degree of passion, but also spoken extremely well about it. And I'm sure the readers who have read the stories will benefit immensely from this episodes that we have shot together. Thank you so much, sir, for being a part of this series.
Girish, it's been absolutely my pleasure to talk about my book, Tata Stories, to talk about anecdotes from this book, to talk about a little bit about my own career. I want to thank you for anchoring the series so well. I believe that, interviews like this are only as good as the questions that the interviewer poses. So thank you very much for teasing out so many wonderful facets of Tata Stories in the course of this conversation. I also want to thank Banyan Tree and Shoradeep for producing this series and taking it to readers and viewers across the country. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, viewers, for being with us and for staying with us. Before we go and we say goodbye, just a reminder, Tata Stories, 40 Timeless Tales from a Timeless Institution and 40 Timeless Tales to Inspire You. A timeless book written by Mr. Harish Bhat. It's available on Amazon and at all the leading bookshops. Please go and buy a copy today if you haven't done already. Inshallah, we shall be back with another season, Tata Katha Season 3. We don't know what we will cover then, but it's been a pleasure hosting Season 1 and Season 2. Thank you so much.